Welcome to everybody that's joining us today. I'm Dave from GEMSEN in Toronto. Happy to have you join us for part three of a multi-part training on DSP amplifiers. Originally, we were calling it 9 sessions. I think it's, essentially turned into 10. Hopefully, you were with us last week when we did session 101A on VXI, and we covered the features and the benefits of VXI amplifiers. And then on Wednesday, we did an overview of the Tune software. So before we get deep into everything, I would love to request that you guys enable your cameras but disable your microphones just to eliminate any type of background noise that can be a little bit distracting. So today we are at 1 o'clock, which is now past. We're doing session 103 on audio basics. We'll take a little bit of a break, and then later on today at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we're going to continue with session 104, the additional terms in audio. So we're hoping you can be there for both sessions. Going back to the 2 original sessions, we did record those. We have them available. They're on a private link on YouTube. So if you go to the registration page that we sent you, there's links down there that you could click and watch them or rewatch them if you feel that you want to do so. And we'll continue to record the next few sessions that we do as well and share those with you. So I'm really happy to have the guys that have developed this training session or sessions with us. We have Steve Teresi. He's based in Florida. We have Kevin Ferry in Pittsburgh, and we have Rob Haynes in California. Look at those beautiful smiles.
They're all really recent features too.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So together, the 3 of them will be spending time back and forth. We certainly recommend that you guys ask any questions. If you are going to ask any questions, please do so via the chat. There is a chat window that's available. If you don't see it, you might need to just look at your menu and enable it. If you are sending any questions, please send it to everyone because Kevin and Rob are monitoring the chat. I'm sure Steve might be looking at it as well. And if you just send it to one person,
I won't be able to see it because I'll be presenting.
All right, so just make sure you send it to everyone so Kevin and Rob can address it, and we'll take breaks in between, to address some of these questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass this off to Steve Teresi.
All right, so we're going to jump right in. One thing I was really worried about today was calling this Audio Basics Level 1 because we got a bunch of guys that I think know what's going on already. Just want to point out that our goal here is to give a basic overview of some of the terms that you're probably already familiar with. These are the key terms in audio that we should all know. Things like amplitude, voltage and current, SPL, excursion, frequency, octave, and things like efficiency. Don't groan. I know you've probably heard a lot of these things before. If you haven't and you're unfamiliar with them, stick with us. If you have and you're just like bored already, just keep this in mind that I want to make sure we're all on the same page as we start exploring some of the more advanced topics. And if you know this stuff already, maybe use these explanations that we're about to give you as a way of explaining to our customers so that they can understand it as well. All right, so we'll jump right in. We'll start off with amplitude. Effectively, amplitude is level or how much of something you have. It's often used to refer to things like voltage, current, power, or SPL. It'd be very rare that your customer would ever come in looking for more amplitude. Yes, I'd like to have some more amplitude for my audio system. It just doesn't happen like that. They usually come in asking for more. I want it louder. I want more bass or whatever it is. And they're almost always going to be referring to a change in amplitude. Now, it also works the other way, and this is almost certainly never going to happen. It's too loud. I want less of it. It's not going to happen. But just know that amplitude can go up and down either way. It's all about the same. So to help illustrate this point a little bit more, we're going to use a sine wave. Why? Why in the world do audio people always insist on using a sine wave to describe things? Why? Why do we do this? And yes, I am waiting for an answer.
It's an easy question, guys.
How do we use sine waves? It's an easy one.
Well, we have everybody muted here.
Crickets. There's going to be a long training then.
That's
Nothing, Kevin?
Conrad looks like he wants to say something there.
Hi.
Why do we use a sine wave? Andy says they sound good. I don't think that's the precise reason.
The reason we use sine waves is not because they sound good, but because they're repeatable, they're predictable. We know when they go up, we know when they go down, we know what they're supposed to look for. So if we see changes in it, we can pick up on those changes very, very easily. So that's why we use sine waves. And what we're showing here is between those two red bars, that's showing the amplitude of that particular sine wave. And if we turn the volume level up, you'll see that those bars get further apart. The amplitude has been increased, so that they're further apart. So the sine wave is being used to represent that change in amplitude. And if we do one more, you'll see it's exactly the same sine wave. It just got bigger and bigger and bigger. That's basically amplitude in a nutshell. So when we talk about amplitude, that's sort of what we're expressing. Of course, it can also mean other things like, SPL and things of that nature, but that's the idea, the concept that we wanted to get through on that. That's it. That's all I wanted to talk about amplitude for right now. Next up, we're going to talk about voltage and current. Now, voltage, almost by definition, is known as potential. So if you're in a car or in a boat and you got a 12-volt battery, what does that battery do? If I took one and I dropped it on the table in front of me, what good does it do me right there? And again, I am waiting for an answer.
Jeff just put up his hands and said nothing.
Right. Nothing. In order for the battery to do anything, it has to be connected to something. Otherwise, it just has the potential to do something. So once you do make a connection, something starts moving, current starts moving, little electrons start flowing through all those wires and start making things actually happen. You don't have wires and you don't have devices. You do not have anything getting done. You just have the potential. Potential, voltage, and current together is what actually gets work done. Now, when electricity starts moving through wires and devices like amplifiers or speakers or multifunction displays, whatever the case may be, there's got to be some amount of resistance associated with it. Even a really big wire is going to have some resistance. Resistance is effectively the change in the motion of those electrons, and that's ultimately how things get done. If you think about a toaster, you're running the current through a coil of wire, basically, and it gets really hot. Why? What's a byproduct of resistance? Come on.
Heat.
Yes, very good, Kevin. Heat. So the heat is a byproduct. Now, a lot of people think that heat is a bad thing. Not necessarily true. If you are making toast, heat is a good thing. So controlling the heat is what really matters the most. And resistance, by changing the rate of the flow of current, is going to be the byproduct of all of that. And there are nifty formulas that can be used to calculate all this. But whenever you have a resistance, there's also something that happens called a voltage drop. Now, very often, if you talk to the tech guys and they're having a problem with an amplifier that's misbehaving, or an MFD that's not working the way it's supposed to, or a source unit that's doing goofy things, almost always they're going to tell you to check your grounds, and that gets everybody really pissed off. And usually when we ask you to check grounds, you'll grab a multimeter and you set it to resistance, and you'll try to measure the resistance. The problem is that's a really bad idea, because the resistance measurement that your meter takes is assuming a certain amount of current. And the current that the meter produces is very, very different than the current that a device is typically going to deliver or draw. So what you should be measuring is a voltage drop. And there are formulas that you can use for this. We're not going to cover those today. One's on the screen as a hint, but we're not going to get into that today. I just want to talk about the relationship between voltage, current, and resistance. And then the final thing on voltage and current I want to talk about is something called power. And we use power in watts to describe a lot of things, and it really pisses me off because I hate it. Power in watts doesn't tell me anything about what's going on with my audio system. Look, I know we put it on the speaker boxes and the amplifier boxes, and everybody's using power in watts, but it really tells me nothing about what's actually happening. If I'm troubleshooting or setting up a system and I want to make sure it's going to work right, I care about voltage and current, and of course resistance as the third part of that. When you look at power in watts, you have no idea what the true current or voltage demands are for that particular device, whatever it may be. So instead of looking at power in watts, and the other thing I brought, I don't know if you guys can see me or not, but I use this as an example. Anyone know what this little device is?
Is that a power?
This is the 1 amp charger. I also have this guy. Anyone know what this one is?
The 2.5 amp charger.
2.5 amp charger. Who cares how many watts it is? You know how much current it's drawing. Why is it bigger? Because there's more current going through. More current means more heat. right? Because current and heat and resistance, it all goes together. This one has more power in watts, but nobody gives a crap about that. They care about the current. It's a 2.5 amp charger. So that's another example. So
Andy says he's forced to buy those all the time.
welcome to Dongle Town, right?
He's got kids. Understandable.
All right, so you have formulas to calculate power. Power is voltage times current. You guys probably already know that. I found a really neat thing to have available is a chart that actually gets away from power and watts and starts talking about current. And here's a quick way to estimate current draw with different amplifiers. And if you look across this chart real fast, you'll notice there's a couple of different things on there. First, you'll see Class D. You'll also see some Class AB. Obviously, we're talking about amplifiers here. You'll also see the terms full range and subwoofer. And you'll see normal and excessive. That's referring to our customer or whoever's going to be controlling the volume control. Next up, you'll see power per 100 watts, per 100 watts. And you'll see various different numbers. So first, let's talk about Class AB versus Class D. Class AB used to be like the go-to style of amplifiers for car audio and even marine audio. But along came Class D a number of years ago. And what do we know about Class D? What makes Class D something that's very desirable, especially today? Any ideas? There's numbers on the screen that kind of give you an idea.
It's more efficient.
It is more efficient. That's absolutely right. And the reason that's important to us is because the amount of energy we have on a boat or in a car is going to be determined by the charging system. And the more efficiently we can use that current and voltage, the better our results are going to be in terms of longevity, in terms of reliability, in terms of performance. So Class D is really the king of the hill right now, and it's being used in almost all applications, car, mobile, even home audio is starting to use Class D because it is so good. And some of the early issues that Class D had was a limited bandwidth. It used to only be useful for subwoofers, but as you guys well know, we are now using this in all types of designs, and it has no problem extending into the upper octaves of audio. The highest frequencies can easily be reproduced with a quality Class D amplifier. So you can look at the Class AB numbers, but know that those are very rare now, and Class D is the king. So take a look at that first one there, the Class D full range amplifier. You guys probably know that full range signal is not quite as demanding as just a subwoofer signal. The bass energy is a lot more intense, and the amount of power and demand that we use at the lower frequencies is far more current hungry than you'll see in a full range amplifier. And these numbers will reflect that as well. So as you see, the Class D full range will pull about 2.4 amps per 100 watts. While a Class D subwoofer amplifier, same amp, if you use it as a sub amp, it's going to draw more at 3.2 amps of current instead of 2.4, just as a number. I'll explain how we get into this a little bit more in just a moment. So let's use an example of a 600 watt Class D subwoofer amplifier with a normal listener. In this case, if we take a look at it, it's 3.2 amps per 100 watts, and there's 600 watts. So you take the 3.2 and you multiply it by 6, and you're going to wind up with about 19 amps of current draw. Now, some guys are probably going to say, that's not right. It's probably more, or maybe they're saying it's probably less than that. But some of the testing that we've done actually proves that this works out to be pretty darn close. It's not an exact science because music is very dynamic, and we don't know exactly what they're playing or even what level they're going to play it at. Since the listener is a big part of this, all we can do is estimate. And an estimation of about 19 to 20 amps of current with a 600 watt Class D sub-amp is about right. If you notice those numbers are going higher, and you can do this by using a clamp-on amp measurement tool, which basically just detects the amount of current going through a wire. If you think that it's going higher than that, you probably have a more excessive listener. And if you take a look over on the other side, you'll see that an excessive listener can draw more than double the amount of current in the same application. So I thought this was a really handy way of getting away from the little charger head things, or even the conversation about power and watts, because it's really hard to make sense of that when you go to do an install in a boat or a car. And ultimately, when we're selling things, we want to make sure we're not overselling for a given application. And when we're installing things, we want to make sure we're not overtaxing a given electrical system. And I think this chart is really handy. To make it even easier, an amplifier that you're going to use today is going to draw between 2.4 amps and 8 amps of current, regardless of the listener. It covers the whole gamut. And if you use that for your planning when you're selling systems or when you're troubleshooting systems, I think the numbers will work out pretty well. So we good?
How many of you guys sell to excessive listeners?
Every hand should be upright. Now, the reason why we use normal as the reference is because if you look at those current numbers, the current gets scary. You know, a lot of electrical systems, you'd be really hard-pressed to find 100 amps of available current to play with. So when you start using the excessive numbers, that's why you have to have that conversation with the customer. Say, whoa, big guy, you might want to take it easy here. As you'll see a little bit later on in our presentation, there's other ways of getting loud other than just adding amplifier power. So this is a good idea to know the charging system and know what you can sell and install into the application.
Cole says he's personally an excessive listener himself.
Good.
So
You know, the first step is admit
What
it, right?
What I like about this quick conversation on current is it really does allow you guys to be smart and reduce comebacks. So by knowing roughly, by guessing the amount of current the customer may be using, especially in larger systems and these newer cars where there's a lot more voltage regulation being managed by the computer, maybe this opens the door for that initial conversation about doing the big 3 upgrade in augmented ground, ways to further improve current instead of having to do it after the fact when they come back because they're running into issues. So now you kind of look like their hero, the advocate, instead of oh shoot, we didn't tell you about this, it's going to cost you extra money. So this is a nice way to get that out of the way before anything that can happen and make a little extra money hopefully while doing so.
Right on. I always I point out that if you're doing a mobile audio system and you don't pay attention to this chart, it's bad, but it's not as bad as a boat. Because at least in a car, if you get into some electrical trouble, you can call your friend to come get you. If you're out on the water, you got to call somebody. It gets a lot more expensive. So, all right, let's move on. Power obviously leads into the conversation of SPL, or sound pressure level. And I know that we talk about this in the audio world all the time. It's basically a number that's used to show how loud something is. It's important to know that it's technically a reference. It's a relationship from one number to another number. Any idea what the number that we're referring to when we talk about sound pressure level, like in a car, where we say 120 dB? Do you know what it's referencing? And yes, I am waiting for an answer. Because otherwise, without the reference, it's like saying something's 50% off. You still don't know how much it costs because you need to know what the original number was. So 50% off of what? Or in this case, relative to what? What is the sound pressure relative to?
chat's quiet too.
Pretty close. The reference point is effectively 0 pressure or 0 dB.
Andy says silence.
Silence. Very good, Andy. Very, very good. Silence can be a really freaky thing. How many of you have ever heard of an anechoic chamber? Hands would be good. Rob has. I see Rob's hand.
Jeff and Aaron both raised their hand too.
So for those that don't know what an anechoic chamber is, anechoic by definition is without echo, and echoic, without any echo, which means the room itself contributes no sound whatsoever. In any one of the rooms that you guys are in right now, if you were to clap, don't. But if you were to make a noise, there would be some reverberation, some energy in the room that would add to the overall sound inside the room. Your computer's making noise, your lights are making noise, the air conditioner, the heater for many of you is making noise. So all of these things will make those rooms non-anechoic. An anechoic chamber, really good ones are freaky. You go into these rooms, there are no lights because those make noise. There's no glass because those are reflective. So it's got weird foam-like panels on all the walls. Some of the best ones are actually suspended and elevated so the ground doesn't even vibrate. If you were to go into this room, you'd have no sense of how big the room is. Like an auditorium, you go in there and you walk in, even with your eyes closed, you get a good idea of how big the room is by the sonic cues of the reflections of any sound that happens in there. Anechoic has none of that. You went in there and you sat quietly, really quiet, and let things stabilize and settle. Eventually you'd hear a very odd squishing noise. That's the blood rushing through the veins and arteries near your eardrums. That is just freaky. That is the reference. That is 0. So when we look at sound pressure level and we see these numbers, it's based upon a 0 reference, which is kind of freaky. Now, keep in mind, there's lots of different ways of measuring and rating SPL, and nothing drives audio people more nuts than when people say, oh, this car stereo system's as loud as a jet engine taking off. They're both loud, but they're two very, very different scenarios. And OSHA and other government bodies will measure things one way, and we will measure them a different way. Please refrain from making crazy comments like that. Just know that loud is loud, and that's what we really care about. Yes, SPL numbers make a lot of fun and a lot of sense in competition, but don't make comparisons to other industries and other measurements if you can help it. Speaking of changes, let's talk about what these changes sound like. We measure SPL in dBs or decibels, and decibel by definition is 1/10 of a bell, a decibel. Deci is a tenth. So this is a logarithmic scale. So as you start going from small numbers to big numbers, the changes are dramatic. Hopefully you guys don't know a whole lot about earthquakes. Sorry, Rob, you know a lot about them. The Richter scale is actually logarithmic. So a 7.0 to a 7.1 is a significant change. 7.1 to 7.2 is even scarier. As it starts going up, it becomes even stronger. When we talk about sound pressure measured in decibels, a 1 dB change is considered the smallest thing that we could detect with a sine wave. So think about this for a second. If you're listening to something and you hear a change in it, the smallest perceptible change that you're going to pick up on is typically around 1 dB. Now, some people will be a little bit less and some people will be a little bit more, but in general, 1 dB change. That change of 1 dB requires a 26% increase in overall power going through the speaker system, assuming you're getting it louder. That's quite a bit of power to make a pretty insignificant change. But remember that a 1 dB change is about the smallest that you're going to be able to pick up on. Now, a 3 dB change, this is considered the smallest, easily detectable difference that you'll pick up with music. This is, I call it the, hey, turn it up a bit scenario. If you're listening to an audio system and you like that song, hey, turn it up a bit. You take it a click or two on the volume control, it's usually about a 3 dB difference. It's not earth-shattering, but it does require a doubling of power from your amplifier to make a 3 dB change. What I really like about a 3 dB change, even a 1 dB change, but a 3 dB change, I like it even more. If you grab a source unit like a Media Master on a boat, I think some of the Kenwood or Pioneer units, they have the volume readout shows a number of decibels, right? So if you were to listen to an audio track at a certain level and you made a change so that that number changed by the number 3, a 3 dB difference, that's what you'd be hearing. So that level difference, you can actually go and prove that this is going to be an easily detectable difference, but it's not going to be a, wow, that was a huge difference. It's going to be a noticeable difference, but it's not going to be dramatic. But it does require twice the power to do that. On the other end, if you turn it down, that cuts your power down by half, which is kind of nice. So the next time you have an opportunity and you're near a source unit that has that kind of readout, you could do that. And if you really want to, you could take a voltage reading with a sine wave. Yes, a sine wave. And you could read that voltage change. And if you turn it up, you'll see a 41% improvement in voltage. And if you turn it down, you'll see a change of 0.707 or 0.71 as an easy number to reference. That'll come into some conversation a little bit, but just give that some thought as you go through.
Probably a good thing to try too is do this on your display boards where it's probably a little less ambient noise, and then do it in a vehicle when you're driving down the road too, so that way you can understand the relationship between both of those scenarios. That ambient noise is really going to end up affecting the perception of level change when you're listening in there too.
It's a really good comment there, Kevin. I appreciate it. Yeah, definitely do that, because the sound room is going to be a little bit more controlled and you'll be able to hear the difference better, but then you'll see how relatively insignificant it can be if you're cruising down the highway. All right, so this is where I think it gets exciting, a 6 to 10 dB change. And this is normally considered about twice or half as loud, depending what direction you're going. The reason why there's a range is because it depends on a bunch of different things. What the audio source is in terms of is it music or sine wave, how bad your hearing may be, what frequency it might be at. So there's a lot of variables that will allow a human to be able to determine if it's twice as loud or half as loud. But generally speaking, between 6 and 10 dB is what's required. 6 dB change, by the way, is 4 times the amplifier power, and 10 dB is 10 times the amplifier power. So this is not an insignificant change in terms of the demand on a charging system or the demand on a loudspeaker or, so on and so on. But it is a significant difference in terms of what your customer is actually going to hear. So these changes in SPL, that's how we measure them. We good? Keep on going. Next up is excursion. And this excursion is not like if we're going on an excursion like our trips down to Jamaica, Dave, as you remember too well. So those excursions are very exotic and fun. But what we're talking about when it comes to excursion is very different. It's the inward and outward motion of a loudspeaker. Now, if you think about it, it is kind of an exotic journey because that speaker's got quite a bit to do as it's moving in and out. Now, this terrible animation, I hope it's coming through okay and it's not too herky-jerky. You can see that the speaker is tracking. Is it okay?
Yeah, it looks good.
Yeah, looks good.
So the speaker is trying to track a sine wave, and the horribly drawn one on the far right is, showing the cone moving in and out. Now, when it comes to a loudspeaker, there's two parts of it. Well, I guess technically three if you want to be technical about it, but there's two parts of the speaker that are going to help control how far that speaker could ultimately move. I need two answers. I'll take them in any order. What are the two parts of the speaker that will control the motion, control the excursion?
Spider from M&M Auto.
Good, correct.
Surround from Conrad.
Fantastic, you got them, boys. The upper suspension is what's known as the surround. It's the thing that goes around the cone, the surround. The spider is the cloth thing that's kind of weird looking underneath the speaker cone that controls it, and that's the lower suspension. These two are intended to make sure that the speaker's not moving too far out or too far in. If these get stretched to a limit, it sounds like if you took your shirt and kind of tugged on it, it would sound like fabric getting taut. It makes a very distinct sound. So when you're pushing the speaker really far, you might hear like a fluffing kind of noise of the suspension parts being stretched or pulled. If you go too far or the speaker's not engineered properly, you'll find the third thing that will stop the speaker's motion. This sound is very different. More of a clanking sound or thwacking sound, and it's when the speaker backs into the back part of it. In other words, it slams into hard parts, be that the frame, be that the top plate or the back plate of the speaker. It's a very, very different noise, and you usually only get to hear it once because it usually causes a very significant problem with the driver. So that's excursion. So we have to make sure that we control that. Now, I'll come back to that in a little bit. Next up, we have frequency. Literally, this is how often something happens. So like if you like to go running, you run 3 times a week. Your frequency of running is 3 times per week. In audio, we're looking at cycles per second. It's how many times the speaker's going in and out in 1 second. And we measure this in hertz to honor dead scientists. Just to give you a scale of reference, 50 hertz would be considered a low frequency, and that's an in and out motion that's happening 50 times per second or cycles per second. Old people used to call this CPS. We now call it hertz. A high frequency would be 5,000 or 5,000 cycles per second. So 5,000 hertz would be on the higher end of the spectrum. Let's look at some sine waves again. Take a look at the sine wave here. If you were to look at when it completes one full in and out motion like this, that would be considered one cycle. It goes down, back to the reference point, goes up, and goes back down to the reference point. In other words, it's like a circle. It has to go all the way around to be complete. So if you imagine a circle that's been split and spread out, that's sort of what this is. Now, don't take me wrong here. A sine wave is not the same as a circle, but it does have 360 degrees like a circle would, so it's a good one to know. So 360 degrees, it goes to the full rotation, and if it did that in a period of 1 second, how many hertz would that be? I'm looking for an answer.
We got 1 from Conrad and M&M Auto.
Good man. Good. Both of you guys. Fantastic. Yes, that would be 1 hertz. 1 in and out in 1 second is 1 cycle per second or 1 hertz. What about over here? 1 cycle takes place in that little tiny area. And I know that's hard to see on the screen, but I'll tell you that that's taking place in a period of 1/8 of a second. So if we expand that out, it's going 8 cycles in 1 second. How many hertz is this?
We got 8 on the chat.
This is not hard. This is actually very easy. It's 8 hertz. Now, I will be honest with you guys. I had originally intended to have 50 hertz on the left and 5,000 hertz on the right. But Christ, you can barely see 8 hertz as it is. Imagine 50 hertz and then 5,000 hertz. It'd just be a big black bar across there. You wouldn't be able to see it. And that's kind of the point. Even 50 cycles is very demanding on a speaker because it's got to go in and out 50 times in a period of 1 second. That's a lot. And a tweeter, it's got to do 5,000 cycles in 1 second. So that exotic journey, it's starting to look more exotic now, isn't it? That excursion, that motion is very demanding as the speaker goes through all these motions. Very closely related to frequency is the term called octave, which is basically a halving or doubling of frequencies. And these could be any numbers. The numbers are really irrelevant. It could be 80 hertz to 160 hertz. That's an octave. 4,000 down to 2,000 is an octave. 323 to 646 is an octave. The numbers don't matter. It's the difference or the interval between them. A halving or doubling of frequencies is what's known as an octave. And you've seen this in audio. It's usually used to describe filters or crossovers or things of that nature. So that's where that number comes in, and that's how you can explain it to people. Next up, we have a term called efficiency. And basically this, in very general terms, is how well you use a resource. I like to tell the story of a manager that wakes up every morning. He's got a certain amount of time in a day to get a certain number of tasks done. So he'll plan the day, and they'll have a task management system. And if he's very efficient, he'll get a lot of things done in a short period of time. The resource is time. Efficiency is getting a lot of stuff done in that period of time. But when it comes to electronics, what we're talking about is voltage and current, the available energy from a charging system. And how well we use that resource is going to determine how wasteful we might be. So this loss of energy, this loss of efficiency, and by the way, there is no such thing as 100% efficiency. It can't happen. Laws of physics demand otherwise. But we can get better. We can get good at it. And any wastefulness, any loss of efficiency in electronic terms is going to be lost as heat. Now, this is not always bad, as we mentioned earlier with the toaster oven. Toast needs heat. It's controlling the heat and managing all of that that makes the most sense. So wastefulness has a byproduct, and heat is going to be that byproduct most of the time. So ideally, we want to make sure that we have the highest amount of efficiency to draw the least amount of resources to give us the results that we're looking for. And Rob was really great earlier on pointing out that we need to sell intelligently to prevent comebacks. So if we try to sell knowing efficiency versus the available current that's available in a given application, we stand to sell much better, more reliable, better sounding systems and make happier customers. So let's start putting these terms to use. Let's start off with amplifiers. An amplifier is going to use voltage and current or power to make power, and that's in quotes for a reason. It's not really making power. It's converting electrical energy into audio energy for the speakers to use. And the way it does that has to do with its efficiency. It's going to draw a certain amount of voltage and current to deliver a certain amount of voltage and current. And if you knew that relationship, you could actually calculate out the efficiency of the amplifier. Those numbers that we shared earlier already factored in the efficiency of a standard Class D amplifier, and the other ones also factored in AB amplifiers, and that's why those were higher. That difference in efficiency was reflected in those numbers. Higher efficiency means less power from an electrical system for a given amount of power for your speakers. Speaking of speakers, let's use terms there. We're going to use the power from the amplifiers to move the speakers, which is the excursion. How much it moves is going to determine on how much power or amplitude you send to it. And that amplitude will trace out to the sound pressure level, which is also an amplitude number. Just know this, that low frequencies are typically going to be harder to reproduce, usually. The example I use on this is a 13W7 doesn't really have any problem doing low frequencies. But C1 650 does. It just can't produce those low frequencies quite the same. We use dedicated drivers to isolate lower frequencies because they are so demanding. And when we do that, things can be greatly improved. Speaking of improving things, let's talk about how we're going to get louder. To get louder, we need more sound pressure level, more pressure. By definition, that's what we're looking for. So how do we get there? Well, there's a couple of different ways. Truly, only a couple of different ways. One way is to use more speakers or larger speakers. And in effect, this is going to push and pull more air. And those terms are in quotes, but you get it. More speakers or larger speakers will push more and pull more as they go through their excursion. Speaking of excursion, higher excursion speakers can push further out and pull further in. And that's how you'd see a change in sound pressure level, by pressurizing more air or pressurizing more of it on a given inward or outward motion. And that's really all there is to it. Now, the devil's in the details, of course. So we're going to break it down one by one. First thing we're going to do is change the number of speakers, or how we do this. And really what we're looking at here is a change in piston size. So if we had a speaker that had 100 watts going into it, and let's just say as a number it was producing 100 dB, if we were to double the piston size without changing the power, so now each speaker is going to get half of that power, what do you expect our change in output to be? We go from 100 to what? And I am waiting for an answer.
Yep, we got 103 in there.
103 from Jason and Cole on the chat.
Jason and Cole knocking it out of the park. That would be correct. Yes, it's 103. Now, I think it's kind of interesting as you look at these numbers. The reason for this is that the power is being shared across two speakers. So each speaker is only getting 50 watts. But the change in excursion doesn't track the same way. The excursion is not cut in half. The excursion is only cut by 0.71 instead of 0.50. And that change there is what makes us still get louder, because if it was cut completely in half, we'd have a net zero. We wouldn't gain anything because the excursion was reduced. That's a pretty cool concept to keep in mind, and you'll see it again in just a moment.
Do you guys
double again?
Do you guys get that?
Sorry?
What he's explaining there? Just want to make sure. Yes or no confirmations.
It's a pretty heady concept, and I think it'll make more sense as we get a little bit deeper in when we start looking at the excursion relationship in just a few minutes. Now here we had 100 watts now going into a speaker that's 4 times the size or 4 of the same speaker. Now keep in mind that it's not just adding a speaker, it's a changing of the piston area. So if you went from like a 10 and added an 8, that's not the same. If you went from a 15 and added a 12, it's not the same. It's if you had an 8 and added another identical 8. If you had a 10 and added another identical 10. Or in this case, now we're doing 4 of them. We had 1 8 and now we have 4 8s. That same 100 watts, 4 times the piston size. What would be our improvement here? When we doubled it, we gained 3, as the guys pointed out. So now we doubled again. So we should get an answer. You got it right before, you'll get it right again.
We got a couple different answers on the chat, Steve. Eminem says 112. Andy and Conrad are at 106. Wade is at 106 also.
All right. So whoever said 112 is too far ahead in the presentation. We'll get there in a minute.
Antonio came in with 106 also.
106, if we go through it, 100 watts into one speaker was 100 dB. 100 watts into 2 of the same speaker gave us an improvement of 3 dB, so that gave us 103. Now we doubled the number of speakers again. So we doubled it once, we gained 3. We doubled it again, we gained another 3 with the same power. And that's the guy that said 112 might have been thinking the increase in power. And if that was the case, you're right, but you're early. In this case, it's the doubling and doubling again of piston area that gave us that output change. So to summarize here a little bit, each speaker is actually moving a bit less, but not half. And that's where the change comes in. And this is what Kevin was trying to drive home for us a moment ago. It's not 0.5 times the excursion, it's 0.7 times the excursion, 0.5 times the power. Now this application where you're adding more speakers, of more of the same speakers, is excellent from a reliability standpoint. There's 2 reasons for that. I'd want both of them. Why?
Less
Power per speaker.
Should we wait for the other one?
Less strain on the speakers.
Perfect. You got them both. So less heat on each one with the power shared, and each speaker is not moving as much, so there's less stress on each one. That's a fantastic thing to do. But the truth is, it's not very practical to put 4 times the number of speakers in a given application. But just know that'd be a really, really good thing to do if you could. Now, Dave and I were really old. We remember back in the day where a company called JL Audio was recommending using 3 of a given speaker on only 600 watts of power. So you get 3 of those old 10W6s on a 600 watt amp, and it was reliable, and it rocked, it was loud, it was great. Those were good times. Now we have these 1200 watt amplifiers that people want to use 1 speaker. Well, let's talk about how that's not a good idea. So we'll get into changes with more power. Again, going back to a single speaker with 100 watts, giving us 100 dB. If we went 200 watts, what would we get? Doubling our power gains us how many dB?
We got it in the chat.
3.
Bingo. Doubling the power, much like doubling the piston area, will gain us 3 dB. If we double it again, what would we get? What did we do before?
106 or 3 more dB.
You guys are on it. Now, if we went crazy and we did 1,000 watts into that speaker, what would we get?
Smoke.
You are right. The speaker that was getting 100 watts before is probably not going to be able to handle 1,000 watts. And in addition to flames coming out of the speaker, you might actually tear suspensions or get that thwacking noise that we described earlier with excursion. But assuming that it could survive such an act, you'd see a 10 dB increase. 10 times the power increases by 10 dB. Now, this is kind of neat. It does show the logarithmic nature of improvement of output. So 100 watts gave 100 dB. 200 watts gained 3 dB. You see 400 watts gained 6 dB. If we did 800 watts, we'd gain another 3 dB over the 400 watts, which would be 109. This is a little bit more than that, so we get 110 with 1,000 watts. So you kind of see how that relationship works out. I thought that was pretty cool. All right, next up, we'll kind of summarize here. The speaker's moving more because you're putting more power onto it. And that's how you're gaining SPL. That's how it's actually compressing and rarefying more air, or pushing and pulling more air. That additional excursion, that change in amplitude, is tracking directly to more output. 2 times the power is 41% more excursion. So you're asking the speaker to stretch a little bit more. So that leads to some possible concerns. What are 2 concerns that you might come into here?
Increase in current.
Yes, that's really good. And it's not exactly the answer I'm looking for, but you're directly correct because it's increasing the amount of heat. Current, heat, that whole byproduct thing. Perfect. You guys learned. Loving it. In addition, the stress on the speaker is going to be moving more, so it's going to cause mechanical stress. So the current is more heat, and that's a thermal issue, absolutely, and the mechanical stress. So that's dead on. Perfect. Moving on, let's talk about larger speakers. So we can't add more speakers, but maybe we can use bigger ones. We go back to our default, 1 speaker, 100 watts, 100 dB. Speaker that's twice the size, double the piston area. This is not just making, it's not a diameter thing. It's a piston area thing. There's a distinction you'll see in a moment. So if we had 1,000 watts on a speaker that had double the piston area, just like when we doubled speakers before, you'll see a 100, or you'll see a 3 dB improvement. So you go from 100 to 103 on a speaker that's twice the size. Double that speaker size again with the same amount of power, bang, you'll see 106, a doubling again. So you go from 100 to 103 for doubling, and 103 to 106 for doubling again. As the speaker gets bigger, it's pushing and pulling more air. That's great. It's similar to multiple speakers, but now it's just a single chassis. Now, technically, this is a little bit better from a reliability standpoint. Any idea why?
Man, even the guys on the chat are quiet here. Control. Andy says control. Antonio says less units to break down. Cole says not stressing. Less stress per speaker. Cooling.
Cool. I'm with you, Cole. Cole, let me dig into that a little bit. It's slightly better from a reliability standpoint because we're less likely to overdrive the system, because for a given amount of power into it, the speaker's giving us more. So we don't have to turn it up as much to get that output. So that's where the benefit comes in. Yes, this is a great thing, but it's not always practical to put that giant speaker in there. So yeah, it's slightly better from reliability, but it's not as good as if you added multiple speakers. So real quick, I just want to talk about the benefits of choosing the right speaker size. So just as a general rule of thumb, this is not always the case, but to give you an idea, 2/8 is typically going to be a little bit bigger than a single 10. 2/10 is a little bit bigger than a single 12. This is where it gets interesting. One of the 13s is about the same as 2/10s, which is about the same as 3/8. Now you know why we did that size, because it's a bigger piston and it takes the place of multiple drivers. If you can't do multiples, use a bigger speaker. On the component side of speakers, especially for marine, a single 8.8 is pretty much the same as 2 6.5. So if you can't put the 2 6.5s on a boat, use a single 8.8 and you get the same amount of output in terms of the piston size. But wait, there's more. If you factor in excursion, which is the other side of this, you start seeing some really interesting things here. I use the TW3s. They happen to be some of my favorite subwoofers to use in cars right now. But if you looked at a single 12 TW3, it has about the same overall potential when you factor in excursion and piston size as 2 10W0 V3s. That's pretty cool. It's about the same as 2 10W1 V3s as well. Or even cooler, it's about equal to 4 8W3s. So instead of putting 4 8s in there, you can use a single 12. Be careful with the power, and that's where those flames come shooting out. So that's kind of where the relationship works in. If you look at the 10s, a single 10 TW3 is about the same as 2 10 TW1s, which is kind of neat. It's a little bit larger than 2 8W3s, and it's about the same as 3 8W1s. So in your mind, as you start designing systems, you can kind of use these relationships to determine what's the best trade-off, what's the best use of our resources, or the most efficient way of getting output for a given customer. My favorite comes in combinations. So if we had a single speaker with 100 watts and 100 dB, and we had a speaker that was twice that size, and we put twice the power, we doubled it twice, right? So we're going to gain 6 dB. So right there, the potential is almost twice as loud. Remember, 6 to 10 dB is a perception of twice as loud to a lot of people. So already we're improving. And if we did that again, 400 watts, 200 watts to each of those two bigger speakers, you see 112 dB compared to the 100. That is a significant improvement, and it's very reliable because we haven't overdone it on any one of those speakers. That is a great way to get loud. That is a great efficient use of the resources to make sure things don't break. You don't get those callbacks where you have to swap product out, spend time doing warranties. That makes a happy customer. That makes a happy shop. That's what I like to do. Sorry, I get excited. All right, next up, another way to get louder is to add a sub. In my opinion, this is the single best way to improve the performance of any audio system, is to add a subwoofer. It allows the main speakers to move less because they're not playing those lower frequencies that are far more demanding. Remember, we said low frequencies are much harder to reproduce. So don't ask a smaller speaker to do it. At low frequencies, it's much too hard for those smaller speakers to reproduce output that's really meaningful. Allow them to play louder at the higher frequencies. And when you add a subwoofer, the sub deals with all the heavy stuff. It's typically going to be larger. It's typically going to have more excursion, and it typically handles more power. All three of those things is going to lead to more output potential for the entire system. And when you add on that the main speakers are also playing louder, that's a great situation. Best thing to do on any audio system, marine, car, home, or otherwise, is to add a subwoofer the right way, which we'll talk about eventually. Now, before we move on and end the session, yes, we are close. I wanted to talk about changes related to distance, because all of those numbers were referenced to a single point. But we can move that reference point pretty much anywhere we want. So in this case, we have a speaker that's playing, and it's measured 1 meter away. And for those that don't know metric, it's about 3 feet. So we're about 3 feet away, and we're measuring, let's just say, 90 dB. If we were to double that distance, knowing everything that we've talked about doubling and halving so far, what would we expect to see it on the microphone? It's going to be less loud. Like if I was standing in front of you guys, the people that were closer to me would hear me at a certain level. And as you went further back in the room, it would get quieter and quieter as you moved away from me. So in this case, it's going to be less than 90. But the question is, how much less? I'm waiting for an answer.
We have
3 dB less.
What was that answer, Kevin?
We've got 3 dB less by a couple guys on the chat.
It wouldn't be 3 dB. It would actually be 6 dB, but even that's wrong. There are a lot of things that can affect the measurement at the microphone. Some of those things would be boundary effects, reflections off of windows or walls or fiberglass or consoles or whatever the case may be. In reality, you probably won't see a 6 dB drop as you get further away from something because these reflections will add to the overall sound of that microphone. But if you were close to a speaker and you got a little bit closer, you're actually minimizing those reflections, and you might actually see a 6 dB increase as you got closer, but it wouldn't track the same way as you got further away because of those reflections.
I
This is all
always
done. Good.
think about it this way: is if you have headphones and you put them right on your ears, and then you kind of move them out and away from your ears a bit, that change is a very substantial change. Or if you have earbuds in your ears, you've minimized those reflections, and then you pulled them away. And you might always have a new guy that you had in the shop that accidentally turned the stereo on while your head was right next to a speaker in the door or something like that. And that also, you've minimized the reflections because you're extremely close working in that tight area. So that's kind of how you know what's affecting it and what's not affecting it.
Excellent contribution, Kevin. I appreciate that. So to round this out, if we're 4 meters away, we've doubled our distance. Knowing what the real number should be, knowing it's wrong, you'll expect about a 6 dB drop from the 2 meter reference point down to about 78 dB in this example. The point here to take away is that in a perfect world, it'd be a 6 dB change as you move twice the distance away. In a normal application, a boat, a car, a home, or whatever the case may be, that change is not going to be exactly 6 dB unless it's a very rare or controlled circumstance. Okay, it's quiz time. Yes, final questions of the day. So I'll make it an easy one. The first question is going to be, how does power, when you increase power, how does more power make a speaker play louder? What's the mechanism that's actually happening? What makes the speaker play louder?
I got my eye on the chat, guys.
It doesn't have to be an exotic answer. That was a hint.
Aaron, you're oh, you guys are going in kind of the wrong direction here. Think about simplify it.
I see amplitude.
Ooh, I like that. That's in the answer.
More excursion, Jason. Hey.
The increase in amplitude from the power amplifier is going to make the speaker move more. And that increase in excursion is what makes the pressure increase, and that's what we hear as it being louder. So amplitude I'll take as a partially correct answer. The excursion, absolutely. That is exactly the mechanism that's taking place. Increase in amplitude moves the speaker more. We hear that as being louder. Next question, 3-part answer. 3 reasons why adding a subwoofer the right way can improve an audio system. There are 3 answers that I'm looking for. It's highly unlikely you'll do them in order. Kevin, Rob, get my answers for me.
If you guys don't want to type them in the chat, you can unmute your mic and speak as well. So
I see Jeff just, he was reclined back in his chair. He just moved up to his keyboard. I think he's coming in strong here.
Go on, Jeff.
More power handling, larger, and taking bass out of the rest of the speakers.
Look at that. He got all 3.
Way to go, Cole.
Dedicated drivers makes it cleaner and louder. Absolutely 100% correct. That's why I love adding subwoofers to an audio system, because of all those reasons. That's a magical way of doing things. And just like that, we're done with our session. You guys have any questions for us? We'll be happy to answer anything.
Thanks for adding in the cell sheet links, Dave, in the course content. If you guys aren't on the chat, definitely open up the chat. There's a few links there that are very, very important that you can go in and download.
I had to type that really fast.
Steve, I have a question.
Sure, fire away.
So the 13-inch subwoofer, I always believed that you guys created that as a relationship to the distance in the trunk from the parcel shelf to the bottom of the trunk. That has nothing to do with the design concept?
Well, you're largely correct. So you got to remember that our first 13-inch subwoofer was very, very long ago. It's about 20 years ago. And the reason that we developed it was we looked at the dimensions of a typical parcel tray relative to the floor, and we determined that, sorry?
Mustang?
Yeah, something like that. A lot of cars, really, that the distance, it would be very hard to fit what was more common at the time, a 15-inch speaker. You could do it, but it took some creative woodworking and usually had to do some weird geometry, especially if you wanted to use 2 of them. It became very, very challenging to do that. And ultimately, what we're looking for is more piston area. So the engineers came up with a 13-inch woofer, 13 and a half technically, as a way of trying to maximize that space. So yeah, that is a large part of it. Unfortunately, now, as time has gone forward, we're using a more traditional 13-inch frame because the W7 was the first one that we did that weird size, Philly. So it's sort of a slightly different relationship, but ultimately the origins of it are very much like what you thought, that the relationship of the physical limitations in a vehicle led us to a 13-inch size. And of course, there's frankly a marketing benefit to it. You know, it's louder than any other 13. There are no other 13s.
Thank you.
And it was true. And from a sales point of view, that did work. From a power point of view, it did work. And from a geometry point of view, an installation point of view, it did work. So the benefits were real, and it did give salespeople a good conversation.
Hey,
Great question. Thank you.
Before we take any more questions, I just want to remind everybody that we're going to be doing the next part of this, which is session 104, at 4 p.m. today. So it's not a repeat of what we just did at 1 p.m. This is an entirely different session. So, I love the content that these guys put together today. I'm sure it's going to be just as good for the next part. Make sure you participate in that as well.
Oh, I will be forcing in participation there too. So
3/4 of the group has about 2 hours to run out and grab a webcam right now.
Cool. Well, that's all we have for today, or for this session anyway. We're going to see you guys again a couple of hours, like Kevin just pointed out. So, yeah, thank you again for your time and attention. Thanks very much for the content that you guys provided to us in your input. We do rely on that. It makes it a lot easier as a presenter when we get some kind of feedback. I feel like I'm with you guys, so appreciate that. Dave, thank you again for rounding everybody up, and I guess we'll see you at 4.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.